She just tracks shipments for the Air Force while I'm redefining propulsion physics. That's what my stepbrother said into a microphone in front of 300 people, in front of investors, Pentagon liaisons, and a 2-star general he didn't even know was in the room. I was sitting in the back row, hands folded, silver pin on my left lapel, and I didn't say a word. They don't know that yet. If you've ever sat quietly while someone took credit for your work, hit that like button and subscribe. My name is Margot Sutherland. I'm 40 years old, and up until 6 months ago, the worst thing my family had done was forget me. Then they stole from me. And tonight, in a ballroom that smelled like expensive cologne and jet fuel, my stepbrother was about to stand on a stage and sell my life's work to the highest bidder. But I wasn't here for him. I was here for the briefing folder in my bag with a classified stamp across its cover and my name printed beneath it. Tomorrow, they'd call me something else entirely. I learned the hard way that in the Sutherland household, silence was never seen as discipline. It was proof you had nothing worth saying. Growing up under Douglas Sutherland's roof meant earning attention like currency. You performed or you disappeared, and I, the intense child, too curious, too quiet, too precise, disappeared early. My father was a defense industry consultant, retired now, but the posture never left him. Broad shoulders, silver hair trimmed to regulation, even though he'd never worn a uniform. He moved through rooms like a man who expected applause, and most of the time, he got it. Douglas Sutherland knew everyone. He attended every gala. He shook hands with generals and called them by first names. And he believed, truly believed, that power was something you wore on the outside. Denial, I would learn, was my father's specialty. When I commissioned into the Air Force at 22 through ROTC, he nodded once. That was it. No dinner, no toast. Just a nod and a suggestion that I considered defense contracting instead. More money, more visibility, more of what he understood. I didn't take the suggestion. For 8 years, I worked in aerospace systems engineering, propulsion research, fluid dynamics, the kind of work that doesn't make headlines because it isn't allowed to. Then, at year 8, I was read into a program that changed the trajectory of everything. Operation Ridgeline, a Tier 1 special access program involving advanced low-drag propulsion modeling. Black Project. The kind of work where your name gets removed from databases and your phone calls get routed through encrypted nodes, and your family gets told you work in logistics, government logistics, and supply chain analysis. That was my cover. That was the story I carried home every Thanksgiving, every phone call, every rare visit. I track shipments, I coordinate schedules, I handle paperwork, and for 10 years, that was all they ever heard. My father remarried when I was 26, Sarah Miller, kind enough on the surface, polished, the kind of woman who could poison a reputation over brunch and make it sound like concern. Her son, Landon, was 8 years younger than me. Ambitious, loud, the sort of person who confused confidence with competence and never got corrected because the room kept clapping. Landon founded AeroNexus 2 years ago, a venture-backed aerospace startup. The press releases called him a visionary, a disruptor, a young mind redefining propulsion physics for the private sector. And to be fair, the pitch was impressive. Sleek presentations, investor decks with animated schematics, a vocabulary borrowed from journals he'd never cited. What they didn't know, what I never explained, was that the core framework he was selling had been mine, my unclassified thesis, written 12 years earlier at the Air Force Institute of Technology, a theoretical model for reducing parasitic drag in closed-loop propulsion systems. It wasn't classified, it was academic, and my father, the retired defense consultant who still had university contacts and professional favors stacked like poker chips, had obtained it through a records request and handed it to his stepson like a family heirloom. They hadn't just forgotten me, they'd rewritten me. In their version, I was the failed academic, the daughter who couldn't hack the high stakes world of private innovation, the one who retreated into a government desk job because the real world was too competitive. Sarah had been the primary architect of that narrative. She built it carefully, brick by brick, over dinners I wasn't invited to and conversations I only heard about later. Margot just pushes papers for the motor pool. Margot tracks gas mileage while Landon builds the future. Margot is a glorified secretary in a flight suit. They had crafted this story carefully, and my father believed it. Not because the evidence supported it, but because believing it was easier than asking questions he didn't want answered. 6 months before the gala, Landon started what I came to think of as the campaign, not just dismissal anymore, active mockery. He'd post on social media about the difference between innovators and bureaucrats. He'd tag me in articles about government waste. At one family dinner I attended, the last one I'd attend, he raised his glass and announced that Aeronexus had just closed a $12 million Series A round. Then he looked at me across the table and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, that maybe I could come work for him someday, filing. The table laughed. My father smiled. Sarah topped off her wine. I folded my napkin beside my untouched plate. That was it. The National Defense Innovation Gala was held in a converted aircraft hangar on the outskirts of D.C., the kind of venue that still smelled like hydraulic fluid beneath the catering. Crystal chandeliers hung from industrial beams. White tablecloths covered folding tables that had held engine components 6 months prior. The air was sharp, metallic, and cold, cut with the faint sweetness of jet fuel that no amount of ventilation could fully erase. I arrived alone. Black dress, charcoal coat, sleeves to the elbow, hair pulled back, nothing flashy. The small matte silver pin on my left lapel. A stylized mountain peak, barely half an inch wide, caught the light only when I turned a certain way. To anyone glancing, it looked like cheap costume jewelry, a trinket, something you'd find in a clearance bin at a department store. 6 people in the world wore that pin. I was one of them. No one was waiting for me at the entrance. No seat reserved at the front tables. My name wasn't in the program. I found a chair in the back row, 3 seats from the aisle, and sat down with my bag between my feet and my hands in my lap. The stage was elevated at the far end of the hangar. A massive screen displayed the Aeronexus logo in rotating chrome. Beneath it, a podium draped in navy fabric. Silence isn't the absence of noise. It's the weight of what people think they know about you, pressed down so hard it squeezes the breath out of your own truth. I watched the room fill. Defense contractors, Pentagon staff in civilian attire, venture capitalists who smelled like new money and old ambition, a few uniforms near the back, ribbons catching light. I didn't look at them. I looked at the stage. Then Landon walked out. 32 years old, tailored charcoal suit, pocket square folded to a point. He moved to the podium like he'd rehearsed the walk, which he probably had. The screen behind him shifted to a rendering of a propulsion schematic. Smooth lines, animated airflow patterns, the elegant geometry of drag reduction mapped in blue and white. My geometry, my lines. My 10 years of classified refinement reduced to a pitch deck. Even the chandelier lights seemed to dim, as though the room itself was leaning in. Landon gripped the podium and smiled at 300 faces. His voice filled the hangar, amplified and warm and practiced. He talked about disruption. He talked about the stagnation of government research. He talked about how Aeronexus was doing in 18 months what the Department of Defense couldn't accomplish in a decade. The audience nodded. Some took notes. The investors in the front row exchanged glances that meant money. Then he paused. He looked out over the crowd, and his gaze found the back row, found me. I want to take a moment, he said, his voice carrying that particular tone, the one that sounds generous but isn't, to acknowledge someone in the audience tonight, my stepsister, Margot Sutherland. Margot, where are you? There she is. A spotlight operator, following his gesture, swung the beam toward my row. I didn't shield my eyes. I didn't move. I sat with my hands folded and my face neutral. Margot works for the Air Force, Landon continued, smiling. She's in logistics. Supply chain coordination? Very important work. He paused for the laugh. It came. Polite, knowing. And I love her for it, but I think it's a perfect example of the gap we're trying to close at AeroNexus. This is revolutionary tech, something a desk jockey like Margot could never comprehend. She tracks shipments. I engineer the future. Another laugh. Louder this time. My father was somewhere in the third row. I could feel his silence. Not the protective kind, the complicit kind. In fact, Landon said, leaning into the microphone now, warming to his own performance, I actually obtained her old university thesis 2 years ago, just to see what she'd been working on before she settled. He clicked to a new slide. My thesis title, my name, crossed out and replaced with the AeroNexus watermark. It was basic, theoretical, abandoned, but I saw the seed of something real in it, and I did what Margot couldn't. I turned it into a product. The room applauded. I adjusted the pin on my collar. Sarah, seated beside my father, leaned over and whispered something. Douglas nodded. I imagined the words. See? She's fine. She knows her place. Landon wasn't finished. He squared his shoulders, looked directly at me, and delivered it like a closing argument. She just tracks shipments for the Air Force while I'm redefining propulsion physics. And honestly, someone had to take that research and do something with it, because Margot sure wasn't going to. The applause swelled. 300 people in that hangar. Not one of them looked at me with anything other than pity or amusement. Not one of them noticed the silver pin on my lapel or the stillness in my posture or the way my breathing hadn't changed. Not once. They thought silence meant agreement. They thought stillness meant defeat. What they didn't know yet was that the propulsion framework glowing on that screen behind Landon Miller was a classified federal asset valued at $3.2 million in research and development savings, that it belonged to the United States Air Force, that I hadn't abandoned it, I had developed it for 10 years inside a program so classified that even my own father didn't have the clearance to know it existed. And that the 2-star general who had just entered the ballroom through a side door flanked by a colonel in dress blues was not here for the cocktail shrimp. He was here for me. I didn't turn around when the side door opened. I didn't need to. I heard it the way you hear a frequency shift in a wind tunnel. Not the sound itself, but the change in pressure. The ambient noise of the ballroom altered. Conversations near the east wall dropped half a register. A waiter paused mid-stride. Someone's chair scraped back 2 inches, but Landon didn't notice. He was still at the podium, still bathing in the afterglow of his own applause, clicking through slides that displayed my work in chrome-plated animation. He had moved on to the technical portion now, airflow schematics, drag coefficients, terms he pronounced correctly but wielded like borrowed tools, functional enough to impress, hollow enough to shatter under pressure. I kept my hands folded, my breathing steady. The silver pin on my left lapel caught the edge of the spotlight that still lingered on my row, and for a moment it flashed, brief, sharp, like a signal fire on a ridge. The woman seated to my left glanced at it. She was mid-50s, well-dressed, an investor type with a lanyard that read Caldwell Ventures. She looked at the pin the way people look at a stain on someone's blouse, half curious, half dismissive. Cute brooch, she murmured, not quite to me, not quite to herself. I didn't respond. 6 people in the world wore that pin. It was a non-standard unit award, minted in a machine shop at Wright-Patterson by a master sergeant named David Taylor, who had been with the project since its inception. Each pin was numbered on the back. Mine was 03. The stylized mountain peak wasn't decorative. It was a read-in badge, a silent identifier. It meant that the person wearing it had been cleared into a special access program so compartmented that its existence was denied at 2 levels of congressional oversight. To the woman from Caldwell Ventures, it was cheap costume jewelry. To the Pentagon, it was a key. On stage, Landon was gaining momentum. He pulled up a new slide, a comparative analysis, or what he called one. 2 columns. On the left, traditional government R&D. On the right, AeroNexus innovation. The government column was populated with words like bureaucratic, slow, risk-averse, stagnant. His column read agile, visionary, market-ready, bold. This is the fundamental problem, he declared, gesturing broadly. Government programs spend 10 years and $10 million to produce a white paper. We spend 18 months and produce a prototype. That's not incremental improvement. That's a paradigm shift. I took a sip of the water glass I'd been holding untouched for 20 minutes. The paradigm he was describing was my paradigm. The prototype he was referencing was a theoretical model I'd built in a classified facility, tested at Edwards Air Force Base at 47,000 feet, and refined through 600 iterations of computational fluid dynamics modeling that had never touched a civilian server. What Landon had was the seed, my unclassified thesis, a theoretical framework written before I'd ever been read into Ridgeline. What he didn't have was the 10 years of classified development that transformed that seed into something the Air Force valued at $3.2 million in direct R&D savings. He had the sketch, I had the engine, but tonight was not the night for me to say that, not yet. Landon clicked to another slide. Now, I want to show you something proprietary. This is the core of what makes AeroNexus different. The screen filled with a schematic I recognized the way you recognize your own handwriting, instantly, viscerally, in the marrow. The low-drag propulsion loop, closed system architecture, parasitic drag reduction through variable geometry inlet modeling. Except the labels had been changed, the nomenclature had been scrubbed and replaced with AeroNexus branding. My variable names reassigned, my computational boundaries redrawn in slightly different colors. But the architecture was mine. Every curve, every junction, every pressure node. I adjusted the pin on my collar, a small gesture, automatic, the kind of thing you do when the room is loud and your discipline is the only quiet thing you own. That's when it happened, not on stage, not from Landon, from the side of the room, near the east wall, where a man in a dark blue service dress uniform had been standing motionless for approximately 4 minutes. Major General Benjamin Scott, 2 stars, Air Force Research Laboratory, Pentagon Liaison for Advanced Propulsion Programs, 61 years old, silver hair cropped close, a chest of ribbons that caught the chandeliers like a mosaic. He stood with the particular stillness of a man who had commanded rooms larger than this one and found them all equally manageable. Beside him, slightly behind and to the right, stood Colonel Thomas Hall, my current supervisor, dress blues pressed to a knife edge. His expression was the kind of neutral that takes years of practice. The face you wear when you know what's about to happen and you've already made peace with it. They hadn't moved toward the stage. They hadn't announced themselves. They stood against the wall like sentinels, and most of the room hadn't registered their presence because most of the room was watching Landon perform. But General Scott wasn't watching Landon. He was watching me. His gaze had found me in the back row, steady, assessing, and it traveled from my face to my left lapel, to the pin, the matte silver mountain peak that most people dismissed without a second glance. This time his gaze didn't skim past it, it stopped. It held. His expression tightened, shifting from professional observation to something sharper, something that carried the weight of recognition. He turned slightly toward Colonel Hall. A single word passed between them. I couldn't hear it from across the room. I didn't need to. I turned my gaze back to the stage before his eyes could meet mine again. Not because I felt threatened, because I knew exactly how fragile that moment was. On stage, Landon was building toward his crescendo. He had abandoned the slides now, speaking from what he imagined was the heart, but was actually the ego. He paced the stage with his hands open, his voice rising. "And I want to be transparent about something," he said. "People have asked me, where did the inspiration come from? And I'll tell you, it came from family." He gestured toward me again. The spotlight found me a second time. My stepsister wrote a thesis years ago, a theory, basic, incomplete, abandoned when she took a clerical government position. He shook his head with performed sadness. "She's a glorified secretary in a flight suit. But I looked at that work, and I saw what she couldn't. I saw application. I saw the future. If you've ever been underestimated by people who don't know the real story, hit that like button and subscribe." He paused for effect. The room was his. He believed that. She just pushes papers for the motor pool, but that thesis in the right hands, it became Aeronexus. He smiled. He actually smiled. And that's when General Scott moved. Not quickly, not with theater. He simply stepped away from the wall and began walking. Colonel Hall fell into step beside him. Two men in full dress blues crossing a ballroom floor with the measured cadence of officers who had walked into far more dangerous rooms than this one. The first heads turned near the east wall, then the middle tables, then the front row. Conversations died in sequence, like candles being snuffed down a corridor. The investor from Caldwell Ventures straightened in her seat. A Pentagon liaison at table 4 set down his fork. It clinked against the plate, and in the growing silence, the sound carried. Landon didn't notice at first. He was looking at his slides, preparing his next line. Then he felt it, that shift in attention, the subtle gravitational pull of a room redirecting its focus. He looked up. He saw the uniforms, 2 officers, full dress, ribbons catching light with every step, moving not toward the stage, not toward the front tables, not toward the investors or the Pentagon staff or the program officials seated in positions of visible importance. They were walking toward the back row, toward me. General Scott stopped 3 feet from my chair. His posture was immaculate. His expression was controlled, but carried the particular gravity of a man who had overseen programs that existed in no public record. Colonel Hall stopped 1 pace behind, hands clasped at the small of his back. The room was silent, completely, unnervingly silent. Even the ice in the water glasses seemed to stop shifting. General Scott looked at me. His eyes moved once more to the pin on my lapel, then back to my face. He saluted. Crisp, formal. The kind of salute that carries 18 years of shared history in the angle of the wrist. Not performative. Earned. Colonel Hall saluted a half-second later. They didn't salute Landon. They didn't salute my father. They didn't salute anyone in the front 3 rows of defense contractors and venture capitalists and men who believed their checkbooks entitled them to deference. They saluted me. The woman from Caldwell Ventures inhaled sharply. The cute brooch on my lapel was no longer decorative. It was the only thing in the room that 2 general-grade officers had oriented themselves around. General Scott held the salute for 2 full seconds. Then he lowered his hand and spoke. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. In a room that silent, a whisper would have carried to the rafters. Major Sutherland, ma'am, we need a briefing on the Ridgeline transition, now. And suddenly 300 people in that ballroom, including my father, including Sarah, including the stepbrother frozen at the podium with his mouth half open and his slide still glowing behind him, went very, very quiet. Landon's hand was still raised, mid-gesture, pointing to the schematic on the screen. The schematic that bore my architecture. His face had drained of color so completely that under the stage lights he looked carved from paper. His mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. No sound came out. The microphone picked up his breathing. Shallow, rapid, amplified across 300 silent witnesses. His hand lowered slowly like a flag being taken down. I returned the salute. Then I stood. No rush, no drama. I smoothed the front of my dress, picked up my bag from between my feet, and stepped into the aisle. The spotlight that had been trained on me to humiliate me was still on. It followed me now for a different reason. General Scott fell into step beside me. Colonel Hall took the left flank. We moved toward the front of the ballroom in a formation that wasn't rehearsed but didn't need to be. 18 years of service rights movement into your bones. You don't think about cadence. You become it. Every head in the room tracked us. I could feel 300 gazes recalibrating. The woman from Caldwell Ventures, the Pentagon liaisons at Table 4, the investors with their leather folios and their fountain pens, all of them watching a woman they'd pitied 10 minutes ago walk through their center aisle, flanked by 2 officers whose combined authority outranked everyone in the building. We stopped 15 feet from the stage. Landon was still standing at the podium. His hands gripped the edges now, knuckles white. The slide behind him, my propulsion loop, my architecture dressed in his colors, glowed like an accusation he didn't yet understand. General Scott looked up at the stage, then at me. His voice carried the particular calm of a man who had delivered briefings in rooms where the wrong word could redirect satellites. Major Sutherland, are you prepared to confirm the classification status of the Ridgeline propulsion model for the Department of Justice? I set my bag on the nearest table. I unzipped the outer compartment and removed a slim briefing folder. Classified stamp across the cover. My name printed beneath it. I held it at my side. Yes, sir. Landon's voice cracked from the podium. What is this? What's happening? Margot, what are you... I looked at him for the first time since he'd taken the stage. My voice didn't shake. My hand stayed still. Landon, the propulsion framework on the screen behind you is a classified federal asset developed under a Tier 1 special access program designated Operation Ridgeline. I paused, let the words land. It belongs to the United States Air Force. It has for 10 years. The chandelier above the stage trembled, a fine, almost imperceptible vibration, as if the building itself had shifted its weight. Landon blinked. No, that's my work. That's AeroNexus proprietary. Could you clarify which version of the variable geometry inlet model is currently embedded in your layer 3 drag reduction algorithm? I asked. My voice was level, clinical, the voice I used in briefings where the audience had stars on their shoulders and the stakes were measured in airframes. Because what's on that screen contradicts the computational fluid dynamics baseline submitted to the Defense Innovation Unit last quarter. Your parasitic drag coefficients are mapped to a Reynolds number threshold that was flagged during the Edwards high altitude test for latency drift, exceeding tolerance under stress condition 9B. The room didn't breathe. Landon stared at me. His mouth moved, but nothing came. His hands released the podium edges. One of them reached for the slide clicker on the lectern. He knocked it to the floor. The plastic clatter echoed across the silent hangar like a gunshot. I, that's, he swallowed. You work in logistics. I work in analysis, I said. My results aren't for public consumption. General Scott stepped forward. He addressed the room now, not Landon. His voice filled the space the way a command fills a cockpit, without effort, without question. This woman is Major Margot Sutherland, United States Air Force, 18 years of commissioned service. She is the lead propulsion engineer on a program I am not at liberty to name in this setting. She has conducted classified research at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, led testing operations at Edwards, and briefed the Air Force Chief of Staff on advanced fluid dynamics modeling that directly contributed to $3.2 million in validated R&D savings for the Department of Defense. He paused. The intellectual property displayed on that screen was derived from her original theoretical framework. Its current presentation as private sector innovation constitutes potential theft of federal research assets. The matter has been referred to the Department of Justice and the Air Force Office of Special Investigations. Colonel Hall produced a slim dossier and placed it on the table beside my briefing folder. General Scott glanced at its contents, his jaw tightened. Preliminary findings indicate that university records were obtained through a civilian records request filed by a third party, he said. That request has been traced to Douglas Sutherland, a retired defense industry consultant. In the third row, my father's chair scraped backward, not standing, recoiling. Sarah's hand found his arm. She gripped it. Her knuckles matched her son's, white, bloodless, holding on to something that was already falling. The unclassified thesis was foundational, General Scott continued, but the classified development, 10 years of computational modeling, wind tunnel validation, and high-altitude testing, was conducted entirely by Major Sutherland under my direct oversight. None of that work was authorized for release. None of it was abandoned, and none of it belongs to Aero Nexus. Landon's legs folded slightly. He caught himself on the podium. His voice came out fractured, barely audible, but the microphone was still live. I didn't know. She never said, I thought it was just a paper. I looked at him. You didn't want the truth, Landon. You wanted a shortcut. But in my world, shortcuts get people killed. He flinched as if I'd struck him. 2 security officers in dark suits had appeared at the base of the stage. They didn't rush. They didn't need to. One of them extended a hand toward Landon, a gesture that was technically an invitation, but carried the weight of an order. Landon looked at the hand, then at me, then at the schematic still glowing behind him, my lines, my curves, my decade of silent work, and for the first time, I watched him see it. Not as his product, not as his disruption, as evidence. He stepped down from the stage without another word. The security officers flanked him and guided him toward the east exit. His footsteps echoed in the silence. The door opened, held, and closed behind him with a sound like a period at the end of a very long sentence. That was it. General Scott turned to me. The formality in his expression softened by exactly 1 degree. He extended his hand. Outstanding work, Major. The Ridgeline team owes you more than a ceremony can cover. I shook his hand. Thank you, sir. Colonel Hall stepped forward. His expression hadn't changed, but his eyes carried something I recognized. Not pity, not surprise. Respect that had been there long before tonight and didn't need a ballroom to prove itself. Ma'am, he said, your briefing materials are ready in the secure conference room. I nodded. I picked up my folder. I turned toward the exit. And I passed my father's row without stopping. Douglas Sutherland sat rigid in his chair. His silver hair, still trimmed to a regulation he'd never earned, caught the chandelier light. His face was the color of old concrete. Sarah's hand was still on his arm, but she wasn't steadying him anymore. She was holding on. He didn't call my name. He didn't stand. He looked at me the way a man looks at a door he just realized he locked from the wrong side. I held his gaze for 1 second, then I walked past. I didn't come back for their approval. I came back to do my job. The weeks that followed moved with the slow, grinding precision of federal machinery. AeroNexus collapsed under the weight of a federal injunction within 4 months. The Series A investors filed civil suits. The venture capital dried up overnight. Landon's name appeared in defense trade publications, not as a visionary, but as a case study in intellectual property theft. His attorneys negotiated. The Air Force Office of Special Investigations did not. Douglas was interviewed twice. He was never charged. But the investigation made clear that his records request had been the origin point and that clarity carried its own sentence. He stopped calling. Not because I blocked his number, because he couldn't reconcile the daughter he had dismissed with the officer who outranked his ego. Sarah sent one message, a text. It read, "I had no idea." I didn't respond, not out of spite, not out of pride, but because there was nothing left to explain to someone who had spent a decade choosing not to ask. 3 months after the gala, I stood in a ceremony at the Pentagon, small room, 12 people, no press. General Scott pinned the Air Force Science and Engineering Award to my uniform. The citation was classified. The handshake was not. "You could have corrected the record years ago," he said quietly after the ceremony when the room had mostly cleared. "No, sir, I couldn't." He nodded. He understood. Some truths are held in trust, not in silence, and the cost of holding them is something only the holder ever feels. The following month, I endowed a research fellowship at the Air Force Institute of Technology, the Sutherland Fellowship for Women in Propulsion Engineering. Not in my father's name, not in the family's name, in mine, Margot Sutherland, the name that had been crossed out on Landon's slides, the name that had been absent from my father's mantle, the name that had been whispered as a punchline at dinners I wasn't invited to. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't ceremony. It was authorship. I work at Wright-Patterson now, same facility, same clearance, same quiet hallways, where the hum of computational servers is the only sound and the work never makes the news because it isn't allowed to. No titles on the door, no plaques on the wall, just Margot, just the work, just the pin on my lapel that 6 people in the world understand, and the rest of the world will never need to. The thing about silence is that it isn't always passive. Sometimes silence is the sharpest answer. Sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one holding the most dangerous information. And sometimes the people who dismiss you, who rewrite you, who steal from you and call it inspiration, sometimes they destroy themselves just by standing next to the truth long enough for it to be recognized. I am no longer missing from my own story. If you enjoyed this story about quiet competence winning over loud arrogance, hit that like button and let me know what you think in the comments. And if you haven't subscribed yet, make sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell for more stories just like this one. Thanks for watching.